So, what if one of the most common injuries in elite sports has nothing to do with overtraining, but everything to do with a simple misunderstanding of the human foot? And what if the fix wasn't more practice, but a tiny piece of silicone that literally rewires the brain? Okay, you're going to want to hear this. Let's dive into this incredible story of biomechanics and brain science.
Here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at a real paradox of pain plaguing aesthetic sports. Then, we'll expose a dangerous repetition trap that so many athletes fall into. After that, we'll reveal the true culprit, a broken pathway inside the foot. And from there, we'll see how a Japanese innovation ended up in Russia, sparking what might just be a sensory revolution in human performance.
All right, let's start in a world where perfection is everything, but pain is unfortunately often the price of admission. We're talking about aesthetic sports, which demand the absolute impossible from the human body. And that demand has a very steep cost.
Just think about rhythmic gymnastics. It is a breathtaking mix of art and raw athletic power. These athletes are performing just unbelievable feats of flexibility and force, and they make it all look completely effortless. But under all that grace, the physical toll is just immense.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When you actually look at the data, in a sport that uses the entire body, you'd think injuries would be all over the place, right? Wrong. Research on Japanese gymnasts shows that one single area gets hammered more than any other: the foot. We're talking 37 documented cases. That's more than double the next most injured part of the body. And if we zoom in on the type of injuries, the picture becomes crystal clear. The single most common diagnosis: a stress fracture. Now, this isn't from one big dramatic fall. No, this is an injury that comes from repeated, concentrated force over and over again. So the real question is, why is all that force being focused on one tiny specific spot?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at how we've traditionally tried to solve these kinds of performance issues. And that, my friends, leads us straight into something I call the repetition trap. For decades, when an athlete had trouble with their balance or stability, coaches would point to things like floating toes or flat feet. These visible issues were just assumed to be the root of the problem. And the solution seemed so simple, so logical. If a part of the body seems weak, you just strengthen it with endless practice. Do that relevé, that pirouette, that jump, over and over and over again until you get it perfect. But it turns out that's a trap. And here's the absolute key. If the real problem isn't weakness at all, but a hidden structural issue, then all that repetitive practice is just hammering the same overloaded spot again and again. It doesn't fix a thing. In fact, it creates the very stress fractures we just saw in the data. So if it's not weak muscles, what in the world is it? Well, the real answer isn't in the muscles at all. It's in the very bones of the foot, and it has to do with something called the body weight transmission pathway. Okay, so disrupted body weight transmission pathway. That's a mouthful, let's break it down. Basically, most of us don't have perfectly even metatarsal bones. Those are the long bones in your forefoot. And this difference in length creates a tiny, tiny gap between some of those bones and the floor. That little gap is a huge problem. It disrupts the path for your body weight and it stops it from spreading out evenly. Think about it like this. A perfectly aligned foot is like a car with all four tires sitting firmly on the road. The load is shared evenly. But when you have a gap under one of those tires, it's like a broken bridge. All the force has to get rerouted through the parts that are still making contact. And what's the result of that broken bridge? Well, this one word says it all: overload. The entire force of a jump, a landing, a pivot, all of it gets funneled onto a single bone that was never, ever meant to take that kind of punishment all by itself.
So how do you fix a broken bridge that's inside someone's foot? The answer is so elegant, it's brilliant, and it has way more to do with information in the brain than it does with brute force.
The fix itself is almost laughably simple. First, you figure out which of those little metatarsal bones are shorter and creating that gap. Then you just slide a tiny, soft silicone pad right underneath them. That's it. You've just closed the gap and effectively repaired the bridge. This quote from the research just nails it. The incredible stability that athletes feel almost instantly isn't because their foot got wider or stronger. It's because that natural pathway for conducting force, for feeling the ground, has been switched back on. The system is finally working the way it was designed to. But hold on, because this is where it gets truly mind-blowing. This is not just a physical fix, it's a neurological one. By filling that tiny gap, the pad activates sensory receptors in the foot that were basically asleep. They weren't touching anything. This is called the light touch effect. It's like flipping a switch in your nervous system. All of a sudden, the brain gets this flood of high-definition data about the ground, and it can make these tiny, predictive adjustments to your balance before you're even consciously aware you're off balance. It's amazing.
Now, this completely revolutionary idea was developed in Japan, but it found some of its most powerful validation in a pretty unlikely place: the hyper-competitive world of Russian ballet and rhythmic gymnastics. Just look at how fast this took off. This Japanese-developed tech, which is called IKATARSAL, was invented in 2017. By 2019, it's being presented in Russia, and just 1 year after that, it gets officially adopted by the legendary Vaganova Academy of Russian Ballet. And this isn't just for students. Today, even principal dancers at the world-famous Bolshoi Ballet are using this.
So why would the Russians, who are at the absolute pinnacle of this sport, be so interested? Well, this data gives us a clue. A comparative study found that top-tier athletes, mostly Russian, were doing difficult jumps and balances in a significantly shorter amount of time. That points to an incredible level of efficiency and stability, which is exactly the kind of instant upgrade you'd get from restoring the foot's sensory pathway, instead of just repeating the move over and over.
And look, this isn't just a story about gymnasts or ballet dancers. This is about a fundamental principle of human movement that has huge implications for pretty much everyone. I mean, the applications here are incredibly broad. Any activity that needs balance and an efficient transfer of force. We're talking figure skating, soccer, boxing, even golf. They could all potentially benefit. The principle even applies to everyday things, like making walking more comfortable, or helping people who stand on their feet all day for work. So if we're going to boil this whole thing down to one core idea, it's this: we are seeing a major shift. We're moving away from a training model that's all about brute force repetition and toward a model based on information. By making sure the brain gets the best possible data from our feet, we can unlock levels of performance and stability we never thought possible. And we can do it much more safely. And that really leaves us with a fascinating final question to think about. We've spent more than a century pushing the absolute limits of human strength and endurance. But what if the next great leap forward isn't about trying harder at all, but about learning how to listen better to the signals our own bodies are trying to send us?